Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video on type hinting. Type hinting, like its name suggests, is simply adding hints about what the type of a variable should be. Here we have a couple of variables already, n1 and n2, which we can see are probably supposed to be integers given that they're 5 and 10, sleep, which would be a string, numbers, which is a list, and values, which is a tuple. We can clearly see what these types are supposed to be just by looking at them. But if we want to be explicit and add that hint in there about what their type should be, we can do so by, after the variable's name, but before the equality sign, placing a colon followed by that variable's expected type. In this case, integer for n1 and integer for n2. Sleep should be a string, so sleep colon string. Nums is a list, so list. And values is a tuple, so colon tuple. Now, you might ask yourself, what was the whole point of doing that? It doesn't seem like it made my code any easier to understand, and maybe it made it even harder to understand because we have all this extra stuff in between our variable's name and our value. And I would agree with you on those points, that type hinting isn't going to be very useful for just regular variables about putting that information in there, because we're not adding any information to our code to make it more understandable. The area where type hints become a lot more beneficial is with functions. Over here, I have a function called addNumbers, which takes in two values a and b, and probably based on that function's name, adds them together. But one question we might have is, well, should a be an integer? Should b be an integer? Should a be a float? Should b be a float? Does it even matter what the types are? Can they be a mix in between? And the only way that we could ever know the answer to that function is if we actually read the function's body as to see what it does. But this is a lot of extra work and a lot of mental effort that we really probably shouldn't have to go through just to understand how to call this function. And the function itself should probably help us out and give us some information about how it should be utilized. The way that we can do that is very similar for the parameters. With the parameters to our function, we just put the colon and then the type that we expect them to be. So if I expect a to be an integer, it's going to be colon int after a, and b to be also an integer, colon integer after b. The one thing though that this type hinting hasn't filled in for us is what is this function's return type? Right now, we don't know whether addNumbers is going to add those two numbers and return the value, or if it's going to add those two numbers and print out the result. But we can add that extra information in there. If we want to say what the return type of the function should be, after this closing right parenthesis, but before the function's colon, we put an arrow and then say what the return type should be. In this case, since I'm actually adding the two numbers, a and b, together and giving back the result, my return type over here is going to be int. So now we know when I call addNumbers that I should pass in two numbers, a and b, and I'll get back a number, the sum of those two numbers. Adding this type information in here is also really useful because if I ever ask for help on that function, which I can do over here in PyCharm by doing Control Q, I'm going to see what the type hints for that function should be. A and b are both integers, and so I should get back an integer. But if I go to a function where I haven't put the type hints in here, like concatenate, and I ask for help on it, I can see that it's saying, well, maybe something that it supports addition, and then anything, and you're going to get back anything, which is a lot less clear and a lot less useful. You can also use this Control Q to get hints or get the help information for your function. So if I do something like sleep.lower, I can go over here and then do Control Q, and I can see that lower, right, it's going to give me back a string, and we're also going to get the extra information about what it does. It's going to return a copy of the string, convert it to lowercase. So I can get that helpful, useful information. If in my own function I also want to add in some helpful usage information about what it'll do, we can put some triple quotation marks in here and then say what my function does. So over here, I'm going to say my function adds A and B together and returns the sum. And then I might say my return type is going to be the sum of A and B. And first number to add, and the second number to add. And now everyone's going to get a lot more useful information if they ever ask for help about my function, about what it does, provided here in the docstring. That's the triple quotation marks right here at the end of the function, as well as what parameters they can pass in, integers, and get back an integer. So one of the first usages and the helpful things that type hints provides for you is a way to know how to call your function, which could be useful if you're working with other people, which is definitely going to happen when you get into industry. They'll know how to utilize your function. But another person that this might help out knowing how to call the function is future you. Because today you might write some function and you might perfectly understand how it's supposed to work. But then 2 days from now, you doesn't quite remember what A and B are supposed to be and what this function does. And so you can save yourself some time in the future by spending a little bit of time now saying, what does this function accept and what does it return and what does it do? And as one of the requirements for this class, whenever you're doing homeworks, you're going to have to type hint your functions to give you some good practice with that so you can build up that skill. The other place where type hints start to be useful is if I have a function here like count letters, which counts how many times letter to count appears in the string. So our type hints are going to be stir for string. Well, letter to count, that's also a string. And the return type is going to be an integer when we count that all up. The other useful thing that's going to happen is once you have these type hints in place, is the IDE is going to be able to give you some autocompletes. So if I do letter to count and then put dot in here, the IDE is going to be able to suggest what methods are applicable to my function or to my object. So over here I can do lower and just type LO and then press enter, and then the IDE will autocomplete that statement for me. Or I could do something like letter to count dot capitalize, and great, it's also going to autocomplete. So by putting in this colon string here, 3 letters, it saved me typing a lot more letters down below by utilizing the autocompletes of the IDE. But the only way the IDE was able to provide these autocompletes to me was because I said what the types of the parameters were supposed to be. If I go to a function like concatenate, where I'm supposed to be concatenating 2 strings, since I haven't put any type hints here, PyCharm doesn't know what the types of string 1 and string 2 should be, so they should probably be strings, so it won't be able to autocomplete for me. So if I do string 1 dot some method, it's not going to be able to do lower for me, and I'm going to have to type that in. Or if I do string 2 dot capitalize, it's not going to know to autofill that in for me because it doesn't know what the type of string 1 and string 2 are. So you're going to be able to write your code a bit faster if you do that little bit of work earlier to say what the types are, because you'll get these autocompletes. The other thing that's really nice is once the IDE knows what your types are supposed to be, if you make some mistakes with those types, it can catch those for you and give you warnings about them. So if I go back over here and I do letter to count, but instead of doing, UPPER, accidentally put 3 P's, it's going to give me a warning that, hey, your string class doesn't have a method called upper. Doesn't know about that. And without even running our code, we know that there's probably a mistake here that we should fix or at least double check, because there's some issue here that this type doesn't actually have that method on it. And then we might be like, oh, well, whoops, extra P, delete that, and now my code is fixed. The great thing about this is I didn't actually even have to run my code for this to happen. I didn't have to have it crash. I was able to know that there was an error here before I even ran the code, which can potentially save you a lot of time with really long-running programs. And this is going to help you prevent you from making a lot of silly typos with your variables and the methods that are defined on them by utilizing these autocompletes, because I know I make typos all the time if I don't. That's one of the other great things about it. The final great thing about it is if we call a function in a way that the type hints don't agree with, we'll also get warnings. So here I'm calling add numbers, but you can see I'm passing two strings, first name and last name. And that's probably not going to work because we said that we wanted integers back here. But obviously these are strings. And if we hover over the warning, we're going to see that we expected to get an int, but we actually got a string. So PyCharm is warning us about this mistake. And if we continue going through this, our code may crash. Now, one common mistake that people make all the time is thinking that the type hints are actually enforced. They're not. They're really just hints to yourself and to the IDE about how things should be used or what things should be. But no one's actually going to make sure that you have to use those things. So when I call this function add numbers with two strings, it's really going to call add numbers with both of these strings. Now, if the function that I call, it ends up working with these types, the code will run to completion and it'll finish like normal. But if I call my function with these parameters and the types will not work with the code that's in the function body, the code's going to crash. So right now, if I actually go and look back at add numbers, all it does is add A and B together. And if you're astute and you remember back from 32A, well, when you add two strings together, that's supported and you're actually going to concatenate them. So if I run my code here, it's actually going to work. And it will say that my full name is Matthew Butner. But if I do it with some types that don't work, like maybe I put in 5 here, well, now the code's going to break because we cannot add strings and integers, and we're going to get that error. But our code actually had to crash for us to know about that. So looking at the type hints and knowing that maybe we're calling them with the wrong thing can give us some intuition and save us some time without having to run our code to know that there's an error there. But if your code will run and the type hints with the values that you pass in and the type hints are wrong, then your code will run just like normal. So the hints are just that, hints, and they're never enforced. But if we go, one thing that you might be asking though is, well, what should the hint for the return type of rule breaker be, since we're not returning anything? Well, if you remember, a function that doesn't return anything returns none by default. So our return type over here would be none. Rule breaker doesn't return anything. And our function main, it also didn't return anything. So none here as well. The final mistake that I see, which really isn't a mistake when people start using type hints, is that people like to start type hinting everything. They like to type hint normal variables down here. But I would recommend against type hinting these variables like n1, n2, sleep, nums, and values, because it's very clear from their declarations what their type is supposed to be. You should only be putting type hints in if it adds additional, useful, helpful information to make your code more understandable, like with the parameters up here, which is what you're going to have to do in class, and what I highly recommend because it does make your code a lot more understandable and a lot more readable. Now, before we leave off, there's some questions that I want to leave you with. Over here, I have nums, which is a list of numbers. Would it be possible for me to get more specific that nums is a list of numbers and not just a list of anything or a list of strings? Or tuple, it's a tuple that has a number and two strings. Is there going to be any way for me to say that, hey, my variable here should be a tuple that has int string string? Or if I go back to add numbers, how could I say, well, add numbers will work if you either give it two strings or two integers or two tuples and work correctly? Is there a way of specifying that? I'll let you know that there is, and that's what we're going to be covering next time. I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Hopefully this made sense, and I will see you guys later in the next video.